Okay, today's daf we're going to be learning is Yevamot daf Ayin Aleph. We were discussing yesterday, if you remember, and the sheet will be very helpful. It's the beginning of the sheet is the same as yesterday's. As I told you yesterday, I put up already into today's daf because we're going to have an exact parallel sugya from yesterday. We started with, the chapter started with the law of an arel. So far, we're basically on the first word of the Mishnah, arel and kolat me'im, which we haven't even dealt with yet. Lo yochlu b'truma. Okay, they can't eat truma. From where do we get that an uncircumcised person can't eat truma? And we seem to be talking here about a Jew who's a mitzvah fulfilling Jew, didn't do a brit milah because there was some reason, like a legitimate reason. Their brothers had died from brit milah and therefore they're exempt. Okay, something like that. Now, they can't eat truma, and we learned immediately, because Rabbi Eliezer learns it from Korban Pesach, they can't eat the Pesach sacrifice. And therefore, we got into the whole issue of Korban Pesach. Rabbi Eliezer learned it from geziera, shava. Same two words appear, toshav and sachir, by Korban Pesach, and toshav and sachir appear by truma. So therefore, we're going to learn the law of arel, that also, just like an arel can't eat Korban Pesach, also can't eat truma. Whole discussion, why did we learn that law, not other laws? We had a whole bunch of different questions on this. That was Rabbi Eliezer's approach. Now, because we got into all these drashot on the Korban Pesach, we're in the middle of that still. And what we're going to talk about now is the very bottom of Ayin Amud Bet at the bottom, 2 lines from the bottom. Hashta da'amar bo lidrashahu da'ata. Now we darshaned already yesterday that bo comes to exclude. It's an exclusionary word, specifically this, not anything else. So what about this pasuk? Kol ben nechar lo yocha bo lamali. There's a lot of bows, by the way, when it comes to the Korban Pesach. So why does it say any ben nechar, which we explained yesterday, means a Jew who leaves the religion, which is always considered a Jew, but yet not for this. They're not allowed to eat the Korban Pesach. If you decide not to be Jewish anymore, you can't eat Korban Pesach. Why you be doing it if you're not Jewish anymore, but maybe you want to be with your family, right? You can't eat the Korban Pesach. So what's the bow coming to say? It's to say that bo hamarat dat poselet, ve'en hamarat dat poselet b'maaser. Okay, if you're using the Quran, there's a different word they use there. Often when it comes to these kind of things, there's different language used in different versions of the text for whatever reason. We're not going to get into that, but whatever version it is, the point is for this specifically, leaving the religion disqualifies you, but not for eating maaser. If you want to eat maaser, even if you left the religion, you're allowed. Okay, what about kol arel lo yochabo? Especially, we just said, arel is taught not just for Pesach, also for truma. So what is the bow coming to exclude? Lamali, what do you need the bow for? The bow is not anyone who's arel can't eat this, but can't eat other things. Well, it is, but not this Pesach, but yet other things. No, we also can't eat other things, but we're going to say not Korban Pesach and other things, but yes, the matzah and the maror. Now, Pesach, matzah, and maror, if you remember, always go together. You're supposed to eat them at the same time. So now they're saying they can't eat the Korban Pesach, but they are actually allowed to eat the matzah and the maror. It doesn't have the same level of sanctity, right? Matzah and maror aren't sanctified, whereas truma and sacrificial meat is sanctified. And that's why they can't eat that, but they can eat this. Now they say, okay, if you have, by Pesach, kol arel lo yochabo, someone who left the religion can't eat. I'm sorry, someone who's uncircumcised, and you have kol ben nechar lo yochabo. Why do you need them both? Theoretically, you could have learned one from the other. So now they're going to show no, you really couldn't have, and that's why the pasuk says both of them. Itzrich lemichtav arel, v'itzrich lemichtav kol ben nechar. Te'i katav rachmana arel mishum demais. Of a ben nechar de lo mais emalo. A ben nechar, if he's a Jew who left the religion, we assume he was circumcised. Now, one who's not circumcised is considered disgusting. Okay, that's the word they use, however you translate it exactly. What their term means is they consider the orla as something not good, right? It's something you have to get rid of. So anyone who didn't get rid of it has something kind of in his body that's problematic. That's different from an apostate who leaves the religion. That's not the same thing. So now they say, if you had arel, you would say arel can't eat Pesach because they have something that's problematic in their body that we call, again, I hesitate to use the word disgusting, but it's some sort of word that's indicating this something negative about his body, which is not the case about someone who's an apostate. And that's why you needed emalo. You might have thought the apostate, no. But Well, kol ben nechar is a bigger problem, right? Or a different problem. Their heart is left God. That theoretically is much worse than a Jew who just isn't circumcised, especially because they couldn't even do it if they wanted to. So, right, you're going to say, Libola Shamayim, though, his heart is in the right place, believes in God. So you might have thought, right, if ben nechar, no, but maybe yes, arel. And that's why, right, arel, the Libola Shamayim, who has his heart in the right place, emalo, you might think maybe he's not excluded from the Korban Pesach, sricha. That's why we needed both psukim. Now there's a very strange line because they kind of darshan words in other psukim entirely by Pesach. Talks about how you eat the Korban Pesach, al tachla mimenu na uvashel mevusha b'mayim, right? To kiyim sli eish, don't cook it roasted in water or don't eat it raw, it has to be roasted. And then it says, and if you leave over notar, the famous halacha, right? Lo totiru mimenu aboker, vanotar mimenu aboker beish tisrofu. So now in both those psukim, it uses a word, I guess they got here because bo sounds just here. Mimenu is the same kind of thing, just from here. Mimenu appeared in both those verses. Mimenu lamali, and this is why I say it's a little strange to mention it here, because they don't even really answer the question. They say, you need it l'chediraba amar Rav Yitzchak. We're going to get to in a few pages, so we're not even going to get into this. The Gemara didn't bother getting into it. We'll get into it when we get there in a few pages. But they say, what do you need these two words for? Oh, that for someone else has a different answer to that, and they don't even tell you what it is. Okay, so I'll leave you in suspense. Amar. Now we get back to Rabbi Akiva. This was all until now. We've been dealing with the drasha of Toshav Sachir, geziera, shava, between Pesach and truma. That's how we learn arel. Amar. Now we're going to quote from Rabbi Akiva in case you don't remember it. The Gemara helps you. Rabbi Akiva Omer, Eino tzarich. You don't need that drasha of the geziera shava. There's a different drasha. Ish comes to include the arel. That means anyone who is uncircumcised. Okay, what's the ish? Ish ki yetzarua ozav, right? A person who has some sort of truma, impurity. Okay, they're leper, they're zav. It's not talking about arel there. And then it says, b'chol kodesh lo, I forget the words here, let me read it. But kodeshim lo yochal. Okay, you can't eat kodeshim, adasher yitar, until you become pure. So from there, he learns, it says ish, that must come, the double language, to include something additional. What is it coming to include? It's coming to include our case, the arel. By the way, it makes sense, even his drasha from the Mishnah, because it says arel v'cholat me'im, they're together in one category. So it sounds like, right, they're even learned out from the same pasuk. So the Gemara is going to ask now some questions, exactly the same that they asked from Rabbi Eliezer. If it's coming to include something, maybe it's coming to include that in the onen can't eat the Korban Pesach, but not about the arel. So they say, Amar Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina, same answer we said before. And the same question is going to be asked on it like we asked yesterday. Amar Kra, the pasuk says, V'chol zar, who can't eat truma? A stranger, meaning a non-Kohen, which means Zarut Amar to the Chavalo Aninut. A Kohen who's in onen is just, he has a certain status right now, temporarily, because someone died in his family, but theoretically, right, we could say, but he's still a Kohen, so maybe he's the one. Chol Zal should come to say, even if he's an onen, he can eat because he's still a Kohen, he's not a stranger. So why do so? They say, Ema velo arelut. So no. The chol, right, so now they say, sorry, I just got confused for a second. This is the answer, v'chol zar. Zarut amarti v'lo aninu, meaning an onen is allowed to eat. So then they say, well, if you're going to say kol zal, comes to say any Kohen is allowed to eat, even if his status is onen, right? Someone close relative died, they haven't buried them yet. Ema for all same price, you could say ema v'lo arelut. Then you could say if he's a Kohen, he's not a zal, he just is a Kohen who didn't circumcise himself. So theoretically, then he should also be able to eat truma. And this whole thing was coming to tell us an arel can't eat truma. So they say that's because haktiv ish, because there's a different drasha, the ish drasha. So the ish drasha said, or let's start with the kol zal means only non-Kohanim can't eat, right? Which means if you're a Kohen and you're an onen, you can eat. And theoretically, maybe also arel can eat, but ish came to say, no, but there's an additional person who can't eat, because remember, the ish pasuk is about who can't eat kodshim, which includes truma, sanctified items. So we're going to say, why don't you put the arel in that, right? So the ish comes to say, but not the arel. The arel can't eat truma. To which they say, umaraita, right? Theoretically, you could have said ish comes to include the onen, and the chol zar comes to say the the Arel can eat truma because he is a Kohen. So it seems arbitrary. Okay, these were the things we saw yesterday. This is all the exact same answer we gave yesterday, which had the same question we asked, which is there's 5 stricter things about arelut, but because of that, we're going to exclude him from eating truma, whereas we're going to include someone who's an Omi. What are they? Mechusar ma'aseh. They have to do an action to get themselves out of the status. That's already more strict because there's an action associated with it rather than onen. Now, it's actually interesting, this one, because onen does need a ma'aseh, but you don't necessarily have to do it, right? And the person has to be buried. That's how you get out of onen. But the truth is, even there's different questions about how long status of onen is. If there's a long time of burial, are you an onen that whole time? Anyway, I'm not going to get into all those details. But this is a little different. There's a clear action that's necessary. And it's in his body rather than onen, which is some external thing. Someone else died, that makes you an onen. It's not something on your body. Anush karet, brit milah, we know it's very severe. You get karet for not doing brit milah. Yesh no lefnei adibor, it existed before Matan Torah, and milat charav avadav ma'akevet. So not only you have to do brit milah, but your children and your slaves have to do brit milah. And if you don't, you're not allowed to even eat the korban Pesach. So that puts it in a very different place. So then they say, right, so because it's so strict, that's what we're going to exclude from eating truma because his status is obviously worse than someone who's an onen. So therefore, someone who's an onen can eat truma. So they say, what? For that, I could argue the other way, that onen has certain stringencies about it. Adrabah. Okay, you're not an onen every hour. What it means is, as we explained yesterday, it could happen multiple times in your life. Whereas your status of Arel, now it might span your whole life, but it's only one status and you get out of it and you're done with it, right? Onen you get out of, you'll be back in that status, right? If you were to get circumcised, right, you'd be done. Nohegeb anashim vidashim, kaninut is applicable to men and women, as opposed to, right, our case, which is only applicable, the Brit Milah is obviously only applicable to men. It's interesting, by the way, if you think, I know there's always this, they kind of ignore the women. This shows a mitzvah that applies to men and women is going to be, right, stricter, stronger than something that only applies to men. And you can't fix the situation, right? It's true, you could bury the dead and then you're out of onen, but again, it's not the same kind of fixing. So what do they answer? Hanach nefishan. Answer number 1 is no. There's many more, right? There's 5 strict things about Brit Milah. There's only 3 here. It's a numbers game. 5 is more than 3. Therefore, we're going to exclude him and include the onen in eating truma. Rav Amal below hanach nefishan nami lo matzidamar. Below hanach nefishan nami lo matzidamar. Even if you didn't have that they were more, you still would have said Brit Milah is on the out, right? Arel is on the outs and onen is on the in. Why? Makra ish ish. Okay, because it says ish ish, notice the language, a man. What does that sound like to you? Right? Ezu davar sheyesho beish ve'eno beisha heveomer ze arelut. If our drasha is from ish ish, and we want to say that's going to include another kind of man, we're going to assume it means another kind of man and not a man and a woman. So if it was going to include onen, it would have not used an exclusionary term to exclude women. Therefore, ish must come to speak specifically to something that's only relevant for men, and that's obviously the circumcision. That was the first part of the drasha, right? All the questions we asked yesterday. Now we have another question, which is, if Rabbi Eliezer darshans shava sachir, geziera shava from Pesach to truma, well, what does Rabbi Akiva do with that? Rabbi Akiva, I shava sachir my avilei. Amrav Shmaya, latuye arvi mahul vigivoni mahul. It's to tell you that not only in Arel can't eat truma, but also, or a Pesach actually, but also a Gentile who actually is circumcised also can't. Okay, but that's the idea here, because even though, right, normally you'd say, oh, well, they're not Arelim, they were circumcised, right? There are other people who do circumcision besides just Jews. So if you had someone who was an Aravi or a Givoni who's Mahul, they wouldn't be allowed to eat the Korban Pesach. So now they say, wait a minute, or truma, right? I assume they mean both. Vahane mulininu. Wait a minute. Why would you think that by Torah law, Arel would be right, when you see the term arel, what does the term arel mean? It means two things: an uncircumcised Jew, and it means a Gentile, even a Gentile who's circumcised. Okay, that's what they're going to assume now. How do we know this? We know it from a Mishnah in Nidarim. Okay, why? The Hatzanan, Konam. Now in Nidarim, it's all about your language. Okay, we're going to get there soon. It's in a few Masechtot. It's all about what language you use. So if you say the words Konam shani nehenel arelim, okay, will be Konam on me, which means it will forbidden to me if I benefit from arelim, from an uncircumcised person. What did I mean when I said this? So they're now going to say what you really meant was a Gentile. And how do we, so what's the halacha here? And here we're going to prove it. Mutar ba'arlei Yisrael. Even an uncircumcised Jew is permitted for you to benefit from, because you weren't talking about him. When you say an uncircumcised person, you really meant a Gentile. V'asur b'mulei ovdei kochavim. And you're forbidden for a Gentile who's even circumcised. And konam shani neheneh lemulin, if you say, I swear I won't benefit at all from a circumcised person, then what you meant was basically Jews. So mutar b'mulei ovdei kochavim. If you have a circumcised Gentile, you're actually permitted to benefit from him. V'asur b'arlei Yisrael, but you're forbidden to a Jew who is who's uncircumcised. Because even if he's, meaning a Jew is circumcised, you're obviously forbidden to. Even an uncircumcised Jew, you're forbidden to. So what do you see here? That you don't need a drasha to teach you that also Gentile. Now, yes, we know Arel comes, the simple reading is it comes to teach you a Jew who's uncircumcised. But it also teaches you about a Gentile who, even if he is circumcised, so you don't need the ish to tell you that because it's already obviously included. There's a very big problem with this method of learning that we just did, because we're going to get to Nidarim and we're going to learn that Nidarim is all based on what people, the jargon of what people use. So if generally the word on the street is, if you say Arel, what you meant is Gentile, it was just a term they used, then basically we go by what you meant, because we're all in Nidarim. It's not a halachic category. Your word, what we want to know is, what did you mean with what you said? And obviously we don't know what every individual person means, but we go by what the general terms are used on the street. That doesn't necessarily correlate to what the Torah used when the Torah said that word. So many people ask questions on this sugya. I'm going to just raise it as a question, and you can look up different answers if you're interested, but it's a little bit of a strange disproof here, okay? Because what they want to do is get rid of Rav Shmaya's drasha that this special word ish comes to include. That's why doesn't Rabbi Eliezer say ish l'rabota arel? Because he uses ish to include, right, that who can't eat the korban Pesach in addition, and aravi mahul or givoni mahul. Okay, to which the Gemara says there's no reason to learn that because it's obvious that they're already included in the word arel. Okay, which again was learned out from Toshav and Sachir. So now the answer. So therefore, Rabbi Eliezer, now we have to give a different explanation. What this is coming to teach us is two other categories. A ger comes to include also, you can't eat Pesach if you're a ger that did a brit milah, or you're a katan shenolad kashum. Sorry, I just made a mistake. We're learning now Rabbi Akiva, what Rabbi Akiva does with, sorry, I just got confused for a minute. Ish is lerabot, 1 second. Oh, sorry, I got very confused for a minute with a very small point. We're explaining right now what Rabbi Akiva does with Toshav Sachir, not what Rabbi Eliezer does with Ish. That we're going to get to after. Sorry, my mistake. We're dealing right now, I said it at the beginning, but then in the middle, I crossed over to the other side. We're dealing with what Rabbi Akiva does with the geziera shava of Toshav Sachir. So what he says is the geziera shava of Toshav Sachir is to say, or the words Toshav Sachir themselves really are coming to include in arvi mahul and a givoni mahul, which we basically say, if you already learned ish l'rabot arel, that would include any Gentile also, even if he's circumcised. So therefore, that can't be it. So what are we learning from Toshav Sachir according to Rabbi Akiva? Because he doesn't have the drasha of Rabbi Eliezer. So he's coming to learn it's to say, if you have a convert who already did a brit milah, so he's not an arel, okay, but he didn't yet go to the mikvah, so he's not yet a ger, and then he hasn't finished the conversion process, so he can't eat korban Pesach or truma. And katan shenolad keshul bahul, what about a child who's born already circumcised? So he also can't. Why not? What does he have to do? If the child's born without the foreskin, you basically have to draw some blood because there has to be some sort of process they go through, even if they don't have the orla anymore. So that wouldn't be included in kol arel. He's not an arel, but comes to Shabbat Sachir to say he also needs a brit milah. Okay? He also needs hatafat brit, which would mean if he doesn't do it, he can't eat truma, he can't eat the korban Pesach. So that's what he does with the pasuk. Now, what we now are left to explain are two things about Rabbi Eliezer. Number one, why doesn't Rabbi Eliezer need a drasha for these things, right? You would think he would say the same thing as Rabbi Akiva, and then he would need to learn that from Toshav Safir, and he can't learn his drasha that he started with. So, right, he can't learn Ariel from there. So what did they say? No, Rabbi Eliezer l'ta'ameh. Rabbi Eliezer is consistent within his opinions elsewhere because he doesn't think that these people are excluded from those laws. Why? Because he holds, remember we had a whole discussion about this a number of dapim ago about what if you do partial conversion, right? What's considered enough for, again, you generally need to do both, but if you only did one, are you already Jewish? So what did Rabbi Eliezer say there? Ger shamal velo taval ger ma'al yehu. If you did a brit milah and you didn't go in the mikveh, you're already a convert. You're already considered Jewish, which would mean you are part of Pesach, you are part of truma. Well, you wouldn't be part of truma because you're not a Kohen, but maybe if you were, right. I guess it wouldn't be relevant for truma. Right? He also holds that if you're born already circumcised or without the foreskin, basically, then you don't have to take blood. You don't have to draw any blood. And that's why a katan like that would be able to eat the korban Pesach because he's not missing anything. So that's why he doesn't use Toshav Sachir for that. And he uses Toshav Sachir for Arel. Rabbi Akiva needs to learn those things out. So he learns that from Toshav Sachir and he learns the halacha of Arel from Ish Ish. So now we're left with one last question. Rabbi Eliezer, hi Ish Ish my avid lay. What does he do with Ish Ish? Because now we have to, right? It's the ping pong. Dibra Torah k'lashon b'nei adam. The Torah speaks the way people speak. Ish means any person. It's another way of saying any person, right? Any man or any real person. So basically, it's just a language they use. That's why it would also be inclusive of men and women, because people often say, men when they really mean men and women in the Hebrew language, right? In English, you wouldn't say men and include women, but in the Hebrew language, ish generally often, right? You're talking about anashim, people. You generally mean people of, both sexes. So basically, that's what he does with ish. New question. This is a question that's going to deal with for a little while. The structure is going to be very simple. We're going to ask a question. We're going to give an answer from some source, from the way we explain a braita. Then the Gemara is going to explain, no, that braita doesn't prove anything because that braita can be explained in 5 other ways. So in the end, we're going to have 6 explanations of the braita. The first one is the one that's going to give us the answer to our question, but we're going to reject it and then basically not end up with an answer to our question. It's actually a very interesting philosophical question, which is, by Rabbi Chama Bar Ukva. I don't know if you have your list of philosophical questions, this would be on your list, but it is an interesting question nevertheless. Katan Arel, if you have a child who's born, within the first 7 days of their life, before they get to day number 8, when they're obligated in Brit Milah, are they considered Arelim? Right now, already we said a person who's exempt from circumcision is considered an Arel that can't eat the korban Pesach. But that's a little different because they got to the point where they're obligated in the mitzvah, and then they couldn't do it for some technical reason. But here we have someone who's not even in the realm, or maybe they are. That's a big question. Maybe it goes back to the question, why do we wait till the 8th day, right? Is the child obligated from birth? And therefore, from birth, they're defined as Arel. In the first 7 days of their lives, they're in Arel. Now, why is this relevant? The Katan's not eating the korban Pesach, but who is? The father. Remember, the father has to give a Brit Milah to everyone in the household. So if this child doesn't have a Brit Milah, right? Okay, number one, it's relevant for Pesach. The question they asked is relevant for truma. If you say that an Arel can't eat truma, now a newborn baby is not eating any food other than breast milk, which is obviously not truma. But what if you want to put, right? Go to the store, they also have baby oil. People put oil on babies. What if you want to put oil on the baby? That's truma oil. Can you do that? Okay. Can you say, oh, wait, they can't benefit from truma because they're arelim? Or do you say, no, they haven't even been obligated in the mitzvah yet? How can you call them an arel? So, can you? Do we say, if it's not even its time yet, it's, right, do you say ma'akva? It still prevents you from eating truma. Ola ma'akva, or not. So, Amar Rabbi Zera. Now, I say it's a very simple structure, but this case is a little bit complicated, so bear with me. Amar Rabbi Zera Tashma. He says, learn from this braita. Now, if you look at the psukim, when it talked about your avadim need to have a brit milah and your males in your house have to have a brit milah. So it says, Himo lo kol zachal, get right, make sure all your scharim have a brit milah. V'az yikav la'asoto, then you can do the sacrifice. It basically sounds like the burning on the altar, okay, which they're going to call the eating of it. Okay, but it's like the burning of the altar. Also, there's eating that burns on the altar, okay, which happens on Yud Daled in the late afternoon. Now, the pasuk about the avadim says, it's all on your sheet. The pasuk about the avadim says, "V'chol eved ish miknat kesef." Remember, any slaves, right? We had a whole drasha on eved ish. Why eved ish, not eved isha? Who you acquire, umaltauto, you give him a brit milah, az yochalbo. Okay, so one says, az yikav lasoto by the zachar, then you can do it, which means the sacrificing, right? The burning on the altar or the eating of it. And the other one says, sorry, did I say it wrong? Yeah. Sorry. I made a mistake. Az yikrav lasoto is actually the slaughtering of it. Okay. Az yochalbo is the eating of it. Okay. Now, what's our issue here? Our issue is that each one seems to be relating to a different time of day, right? The shchita you do in the early afternoon of, right? Tamid nishchat, remember we had all exactly what time it's done depending on the days. It's 6.5 hours, 7.5 hours, 8.5 hours into the day. That's when you do the shchita. The eating of it happens at night, okay? But here, and this is something I was trying to figure out before class I was struggling with, but I assume they mean that even though it's night and that's the next day, they seem to be saying it's the same day. Okay, how they're getting that, I guess, because the obligation kicks in to eat it already once it's sacrificed on the altar. Somehow you have to assume they mean it's on the same day. Okay, so now, what you have here is each is relating to a different time of day. So it means if you haven't done your scharim, they don't have a brit milah by the time of shchita, which is earlier, you can't do the korban. But the avadim, let's say they weren't slaughtered, they weren't circumcised at the time of the slaughter, but they were circumcised by the time of eating, then you can eat the korban Pesach, even though they weren't circumcised earlier. So now they want to know, since each one used a different time of day to be the critical time, they want to know, how do we know that they're applicable in both directions? That basically, right, let's say you had someone who was not circumcised at the time of shechita, but was circumcised by the time of achila, would he be able to eat or not? How do you know that the definitions for each one apply to both, right, to both categories? Talmud lomar, az the geziera shava. Both said az. Then you can eat it, or then you can go and do it. Therefore, the az says they're both true applicable for both. So now they say, and here's going to come as proof. We want to find a case where we have a child who is considered an arel, even though he couldn't have fulfilled the mitzvah, right? So we want to find what now we have to do in this case is to find a case where a child wasn't obligated in brit milah before and is obligated in brit milah now, right? Because we have to have, right, before shechita and after shechita. Something changed. We can imagine a case where you would have a case where you're obligated in, right, where the eved becomes obligated in brit milah in between, right? So they're not arelim before, right? Because how could you not be arel before? Of course you were uncircumcised. If you're uncircumcised now, you were uncircumcised before. So how could you have this case? Let's say you acquired him. Now, I don't know how you're busy acquiring slaves on Erev Pesach, but let's assume, right, you had some time somehow. So you acquired him in between. That meant you didn't have him before. You now have him now. That would mess you up because that's what we just said, right? It would be in between. Right? How could you have a case of a child? If he's obligated in the morning of that day, right, when it's time for shechita in early afternoon, then he's obviously obligated, right? In other words, either he's uncircumcised then or there's not going to be a case where a child all of a sudden becomes, right, the day number 8 comes in, you're obligated in brit milah from the morning. So he would be uncircumcised the entire day. You can't have a case where he's not an issue before and now all of a sudden it is an issue. So, oh wait, if the child is born exactly in between the shechita and the eating part, that would be a perfect case that we would say this is braita is referring to that. then what do you see here? If he's just born, he's obviously not obligated to brit milah till day number 8, right? That's next week. So from here you can learn arelut, not in its right time, right? Is arelut, meaning if your child is born right before and you haven't done a brit milah because you can't eat the korban Pesach that year. So Amar Rabbi. Rabbi says, what are you talking about? The pasuk says what you're saying is ridiculous. You can't penalize someone because their child was born right then. Now they can't eat the korban Pesach. It says, give a brit milah to all your male children, and then you can eat. That obviously means only if this guy, it was not even in the realm of being able to do a brit milah. It's only that we're penalizing you for not having taken care of it. There's no way you could have taken care of it. So it can't possibly be. So Ella Hachabamais came. They're basically going to explain the braita in a different way. We're going to come up now, like as I said before, with 5 different situations where the child would not have been obligated before the shechita, but is obligated after. And then you would have a case that we're looking for. So what do we say? If he got a fever and the fever went away, right? When the time of shechita was, he had a fever. You can't do the brit milah when the baby has a fever, but the fever broke, and then he could do the brit milah, and then if the father doesn't do it, he's penalized. So they say, what are you talking about? You have to wait 7 days. You don't, kid finish the fever, you give a brit milah right away. That's ridiculous, right? We all know you wait. So how long do you wait? The halacha is you wait 7 days to make sure they're really over the fever before you, right? Their body strength is returned to give them the brit milah. So they say, okay, so it's that you waited 7 days. He got sick on the 7th of Nisan. It's now the 14th of Nisan, right? He got sick and got better on the 7th. Count, right? And when did it come out? It comes out in between the shechita. When you get to the counting of the 7 days, the 7th day is exactly in between the shechita, right? He got better in the afternoon of that day, right? 7 days ago. They say, but no, if that's the case, given the brit milah in the morning, in other words, who says it's 7 days on the clock, exactly by the hour? No, he's already obligated in the morning, which means, again, we don't have a good case. So no. Inan, turning out I'm a bet, me'et late. You need it on the clock, okay? When normally a child is born, we don't count it on the clock to give them the brit milah. We don't say, okay, you were born at 5 in the afternoon, do the brit milah at 5 in the afternoon. But, right, 8 days later. But if it's that they got better, and then you waited 7 days, you wait 7 days from the moment they got better. So they say, wait, but that's not true. It says in a braita, Yom havra'ato ki Yomi valdo. The day he healed is like the day he was born, which what could that possibly mean other than my love, Yomi valdo lo be'ina me'ele. Just like when you're born, you don't count it on the clock, right? Exactly 8 days later on that hour. Af Yom havra'ato lo be'ina me'ele. Likewise, when he heals, you don't need, right? Isn't that what it means? You don't need to be on the clock and you'd be obligated in the morning, in which case this isn't a good answer. No, that's not what the braita means. The braita really means adif yom havra'ato mi yomi valdo. The day he gets better is stronger, is different somehow. Okay, adif usually means better. It doesn't really mean better here. It just means it's different. Yomi valdo lo be'ina me'ele. You don't need it on the hour when you're born. V'ilu yom havra'ato, but the day you heal, be'ina me'ele. You need it on the clock, and therefore that answer stands. It could be that he got better 7 days earlier, exactly on that hour in between the shechita and later, right? Like after the 8.5 hours into the day. And then it would be a situation where he couldn't have done the circumcision before, but he could after, right? In between. Rav Papa Amar, he woke up that morning with pain in his eyes. And then he was healed in between. Now that's something, it's not a fever that you have to wait 7 days. There was some problem with his eyes. You wait to the end of the day, right? If at some point during the day it heals, you can do the brit milah, and that would be the situation here. It's the second time we've used this as an excuse in the last few days, right? You have to wonder how common this is. Both parents were in jail and they got out. So now what do you have to assume? They sent messengers to take care of their shechita, of their Pesach, and that was done before they got out of jail. But then they got out of jail and they haven't yet given their son a brit milah because they weren't able to, because they weren't around. And then they become obligated in giving their son a brit milah, and that would be the situation. Or Rav Kahana, Bereder, Rav, you can see how creative they're getting. Rav Kahana, Bereder, Rav Nechemia Amar Kegon Tum Tum Shenikha V'Nimtza Zachar Beni Beni. the baby was a tumtum, which means their genitals were covered. We didn't know if he was male or female. And then it was torn. The skin that was covering it was torn. And we discovered he was male. And then all of a sudden he became obligated to brit milah immediately. And that again transpired all on Erev Pesach in the afternoon, late afternoon. Rav Shrev Yamar, this is going to be a very creative one. The baby's head came out, 8 days earlier. And now wasn't actually born until after, I don't know if you can imagine such a situation happening. The head came fully out, but then the baby wasn't actually born for another whole week. So we're going to have some questions on this. Can the child actually survive like that? Tanya doesn't say in a braita. Again, they don't bring science, they bring braita to prove. Once a baby comes out into the air of the world, and they assume that means the head came out. By the way, I assume, and there's all sorts of, I assume, again, it's not so clear. I assume what they mean is the head went back in. There's all sorts of situations. We're going to get to Gemara. Those who've learned many sugyas already might remember this. I don't think we got to it this cycle, where a baby puts his head out, and then once head is already out, there's already considered there's certain things as if it was born, and then let's say there's twins, and then the head goes back in, and then the other child comes out, who's the bechor, all sorts of things comes up with animals. So anyway, I assume the baby's head came out and then went back in. So now they say it can't possibly be, because as soon as the head comes out, this is use it kind of as a quip. But what does it mean? What was closed is now open. What was sealed, like the nose and the mouth, which is sealed inside, but it opens up then. And the umbilical cord closes up. Right now, how is the baby going to get sustenance inside the womb if the umbilical cord is already closed? Right? If that didn't happen, they wouldn't be able to survive even 1 hour. So anyway, what do they say? If you thought that was strange in the situation, this seems even more strange. Because the whole question is, how's that child getting sustenance? Well, he was sustained by a fever. What exactly does this mean? Whose fever? Ishata deman. If it was his disease, well, he was sick with a high fever and that sustained him. I was thinking maybe, when you get a high fever, you don't eat often for a long time and you can still survive, right? Maybe that's what they're afraid. I don't know. It's very strange that they think a hot fever can keep the kid sustained. Obviously, it's not his fever. We know because we just already said, he didn't need to wait the 7 days. So that for sure can't be it. It's his mother had a high fever, and that high fever kept him sustained. I really don't know the reality of this and how that would work. Alternative option, which is more of a reasonable option. Okay, there's debate what exactly ma'ave means, but it seems, I think from Rabbi Yochanan, he says that ma'ave means if it wasn't, that is, yes, normally when the the umbilical cord gets sealed up. In this case, it wasn't sealed up, okay? And basically, head came out, but it didn't cause his mouth and nostrils to open up and his umbilical cord to close up. No, it continued, and that continued to sustain him for those days. And then again, he was born now because he put the head out. 8 days before, the bris is on that, right? He's chayav for the bris on that day from the morning, but he's not out of the womb. You can't do it until the baby comes out of the womb. Baby came out of the womb exactly, right? Was born fully in that afternoon, okay? I think, on the one hand, you might say this sounds a little ridiculous. On the other hand, you think the rabbis maybe get some points for creativity here. Okay, next. Amar Rabbi Yochanan mishum Rabbi Benah. Okay, that was all a question. Ariel before his time. Do we consider him an Ariel before day number 8? Does that prevent his father from doing brit milah? Or really, the question was really about truma. Okay, does that prevent him from benefiting from truma at all, like oils made from truma, right? Made from olives that are truma olives or whatever. Now, we don't have an answer in the end because we tried to use the source to prove it. We gave 5 other explanations for that source. They have nothing to do with this topic. Amar Rabbi Yochanan mishum Rabbi Benah. Another thing. And now we're going to get into a very fascinating topic of historically what happened when the Jews crossed over the Jordan into Israel. And they did this big brit milah, what exactly was going on. Shuli Mishkan has a whole article about it and flashback on our site. So you can read up about it from a historical perspective. Amar Rabbi Yochanan mishum Rabbi Benah. Ariel mekabel hazah. Okay, an Ariel can get sprinkled with the paraduma waters, okay, even though he's an Ariel. How do we know this? Well, right? You would think. We already learned before that it's a very high sanctity, the mechatat. So just like truma, you can, and Korban Pesach, you can't, maybe you also can't get the paraduma water sprinkled on you. But now they say you obviously can, because look at the Jews in the desert. The proof from them that they did. Shekem b'avotenu, or the Jews crossing into the land. They must have gotten sprinkled with the paraduma waters even when they were still uncircumcised. How do we know this? Shenema, v'ha'am alumin ha'yarden ba'asor l'chodesh harishon. Okay, here we go. People cross the Jordan River on the 10th of the month, 10th of Nisan. So ba'asara lo mechila. Now, we're going to learn in a minute that they all did a brit milah when they got into the land. So now they say, clearly they didn't do the brit milah on the day they were traveling because mishum kol shel de'orcha, they were weak. You can't do brit milah when your body's weak. Haza'ah. Now, the assumption is, number one, they did a brit milah. Number two, they needed to become impure from all the people. Remember, people were dying in the desert all the time. All those 40 years, right? All the time people were dying because of the cheda meraglim, sin of the spies. So because of that, they must have been tamei lamed, and now they needed to do it, right? Where they got a paraduma from and all that, I don't know. But assuming they were sprinkling waters on themselves in order to do the korban Pesach, basically, when would they do it? So, haza'ah, right? You have to do it on day number 3 and day number 7. And only after that, you become pure. So, lav kashem arelim, right? Did they not do it when, if the brit milah was on the 11th, and they do, let's say day number 3 was on the 11th. Day number 7 would be on the 15th of the month. That would be beyond the day that they did the korban Pesach. So it must be, right, that they did it before. So otherwise they wouldn't be able to do the korban Pesach. So they must have sprinkled the paraduma waters before they did the brit milah. And from there you can see Ariel can sprinkle paraduma waters. So what are you talking about? Duma lo avid Pesach klal. Maybe they didn't do Pesach that year. Okay, that's definitely not possible. I don't know why they even ask it. Lo sakadavtach dichtiv yasu et Pesach. It says they did the Pesach that year on the 14th of the month. Matkef la marzucha v'dilma Pesach haba b'tuma haya. Remember Pesachim? You can do it if most of the people are impure. You can do it. So maybe they were all impure and they did the Pesach anyway. No. Amalei Ravashi Tanya Behedya. There's a braita explicit that says malu v'tavlu v'asu b'schem b'tara. They did brit milah. Then they did, right? This was a whole big to do. The first few days they got into the land, right? They did brit milah. They purified themselves and they ate the korban Pesach. So it must be haza'ah can be done before. So now we're going to get into this thing about the brit milah. We're only going to get started today. The obvious question we're only going to get to tomorrow, which is, why didn't they do brit milah in the desert? Why were they all of a sudden only now doing circumcision? What, all the Jews in the desert were uncircumcised? So Amar Rabbi Yitzchak Amarav, lo nitna priat milah l'Avraham Avinu. There's two parts of milah. One is cutting the foreskin, and the other is peeling back some of the skin that's there. That's called priah. So wasn't that mitzvah was not given to Abraham? How do we know? From Yoshua. Ba'etahi amar Hashem Yoshua, which this word we're talking about. Aseh lecha chorvot tzurim. Okay, the important part is the second part of the pasuk. He says, get yourself knives. And then he says, V'shuv mol et b'nei Yisrael sheni. And again, give a brit milah to the Jewish people a second time. So they say, right, what must he have been commanded to do priah? We want to understand what shuv and what mol is. Again and second. That sounds, first of all, both the same, and they both seem unnecessary, right? But maybe it's referring to those who weren't circumcised at all, as we said before, right? Because it describes there that the people who left this in Yoshua, it describes the people who left Egypt all had brit milah, but the people who were in the desert did not. Okay, again, we're going to get back to why not, but maybe it means those people. So they say, no, but that doesn't work with the words. In came my shuv. Shuv sounds like he was doing something an additional time. It must be that's including priah. Maybe there were some who didn't have brit milah, and those who did got priah also. Umay shinit. So what's the second thing, right? That they got it a second time after it already said, and again, seems to be repetitive. This is to teach you something different, which is you really have to finish the job. Okay? Okay, there's a mission that says there are parts that if you didn't cut them off entirely, it will prevent the brit milah from actually being complete. Okay, it's flesh that's covering the majority of the atara. That's the tip. You can't eat truma if you didn't fix that. What does it mean? Rov hatara. It means basar chofet rov gov hashal hatara. It means it's covering the majority of the height of the tip. That would be a problem. It's not covering the majority of the height, and it's not a problem. Anyway, that's just explaining what these tzitzit mean. So we now explain shuv means there was mitzvah of priah. I'm sorry, shuv comes to say he was commanded to do priah, an additional element. And right, there's a whole question here. The Rishonim also asked what Yoshua made up this new law, or he was given all of a sudden a new law. Wasn't this from before? Anyway, a whole question is asked about that. And shenit is to say that they have to make sure it was complete. Okay, if it's not complete, then you can't eat truma or other things that your brit milah is not valid. Okay, tomorrow we'll get to why didn't they do brit milah in the desert. Have a great day, everyone.